I decided to get whiskey instead of water for this conversation.
Is it, are you thinking this is going to be 2 episodes, or do we need more?
No, I think we can make 2 episodes from this.
Okay.
So I think the cutoff with the whole me ordering more stuff lasting less than a week makes sense for the other one. And then 1 episode focused on the Bill Burr stuff.
Something funny?
Sure.
I figured out, was able to find what I needed to find for my follow-up to
Already? That was quick.
It was quick. I found a concise place, and it had it had more than I was expecting to find.
So what you're really saying is
you
didn't really do the research up to waiting for me to get back with my whiskey.
Correct.
No, it's all good. Let's go ahead.
Okay. So the first place I can see, this was in a Wikipedia article, and this is follow-up for the 3.5-inch floppies. And the first year that I guess it was available to purchase was 1982. It was the 3.5-inch. I don't know. It says HP, so I don't know if it means that it was developed by HP or sold by HP. It's unclear, because HP doesn't fit any of the abbreviations. But it was it's the 3.5-inch HP SS being single-sided. There's going to be a lot of these single-sided floppy disk. The formatted storage was 280 kilobytes, 256 byte sectors, 16 sector tracks, and then 70 tracks, and it was marketed as a 264 kilobyte diskette. Then 1983, we get a 3.5-inch floppy, the single-sided double density diskette. So its formatted storage was 360 kilobytes. Somehow it was 400 kilobytes on the Macintosh, but it was marketed as 500 kilobytes. It seems like the marketing seems really, what's the word? Misleading. Yes. So also in 1983, you had a 3.5-inch single-sided double density diskette that could be formatted at 720 kilobytes, 800 on the Macintosh, and 880 on RISC OS on an Amiga, and it was marketed as a 1 megabyte. So, I feel like the marketing capacity there's a lot of overhead, or I guess maybe there's. It just seems like there's a lot of overhead with such small capacities.
Yes. Like as you're going through them, the one thing that just keeps jumping back into my head is, you remember when Apple re-pushed kind of a focus on what actual capacity was after formatting?
Yes.
For drives, and the only thing that keeps coming to mind is that it had continued to be a misleading practice prior to that push, and I'm not truly claiming that. Like that came to mind that maybe that was part of the conversation, because I know from my standpoint, thinking about like capacities and everything else, I never felt like the quote unquote advertised maximum capacity or advertised capacity was an accurate representation of the amount of storage available. Whereas nowadays, it does feel like the advertised capacity is a representation of the actual storage capacity available. So I'm not saying that the two are intertwined or anything. I'm just saying that conversation comes to mind as maybe there was more of a level set to it than I gave credit for at the time. I don't know.
Well, I was thinking that, if I'm not mistaken, so if you were to count on a base 10, 1 megabyte is 1 million bytes, correct?
Correct.
But the way the calculation is made by the computer, it's not exactly a base 10 calculation, and that's why there's disparity between. Am I correct?
Correct.
Right. So what is the base counting system that the computer is the file system is calculating the storage capacity?
Good question.
More follow up for another time?
Yeah. So
I'm not following up on that.
Yeah, I'm not either. I mean, it comes down to the easiest way to explain it to just a random person listening. 1 gigabyte would be the rough equivalent of 1,000 megabytes, except that it's not. It's 1,024, and it's because of this conversion from bytes to bits that there's a problem.
Okay.
And I don't remember the actual calculation and conversion, but it's related to that storage capacity on disk for a bit as opposed to a...
Because bits and bytes are different.
Yes.
Like very different.
Yes.
And which is often why you see bits in, I guess, a base 8 calculation, because you go, you have, like, thinking about memory, we shouldn't be, the base memory shouldn't be 8 gigabytes on a computer, but it is. And then you go to 16, and that, it used to be you would go from 16 to 32 because you would pair. I think you'd do you'd have matched pairs. But looking at some of the devices now, you see 24-bit. You can see 24 gigabytes.
So even back in the day, you could do 24. It depended a lot on the type of memory and everything else. So
because I do remember especially in the Power PC days, that was not uncommon. It wasn't uncommon to have RAM inside the computer in one place, and then another bank or another couple of sockets for RAM that were user accessible. Do you remember this?
I do, but so what's funny is it's actually, you have to abstract this a little bit from the Mac architecture as well. So with the original generations of chips through the Pentium 4, I think. Maybe the Pentium 3. What it comes down to is the original Intel chips, and then the AMD counterparts and subsequent other derivatives. So PowerPC would be, even though it's a different architecture, I'm including that as a derivative for this part of the conversation. Originally, CPUs did not require, quote unquote, matched memory. And so you could run like an 8 meg and a 4 meg and a 4 meg, or whatever combination of chips to fill the slots that you had, assuming the memory was compatible with the motherboard itself. And then eventually we reached a point where certain CPU and board combinations required matched pairs of memory, so you could only run like 2 8 meg or 2 16 meg or 4 8 meg or 4 16 meg, like some combination of matched pairs of memory, or the machine would not run. It wasn't compatible. It could not work and function appropriately. And during that era, we lost a lot of the increments of 8 for memory, only to eventually reach a point where the increments of 8 became possible again, because matched memory was no longer a requirement, because it wasn't necessarily pairs of memory banks that were performing functions as much as it was available memory, again, like it was in the early days. Granted, there's a whole difference in how the memory is used and accessed and everything else from the early days to now. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a return to that, so to speak. But in that interim kind of middle era, the reason you lost some of the multiples of 8 was because you had to run matched pairs for in and out, kind of, for making it simplistic, in and out bus or transfer of
it affected
information.
performance.
Yeah.
And if there was, it gets tricky. I was going to say, I think part of the reason why I went from 16 to 8 to 16 and then 16 to 32 and skipped 24 in my example was because there's also the whole fact that Apple and thinking about this, I've been Apple centric, and there got to be a point where Apple, pretty much every computer except for the highest end desktop, which was the Mac Pro, they would only put 2 sockets. So like that was, you couldn't, I guess you could do 20, a 16 and an 8 and to get 24, but I don't think that was a support. For some reason, I feel like it wasn't a supported configuration.
I don't think it was officially supported, and it would have been hampered from a performance perspective.
Right, because like having them matched if not having them matched would affect the performance. And then when you get to the higher end Mac Pro, it even got to the point where not only would it affect performance, you had to match them for the processors I guess it was the bus. You had to match them, and they had to be put into certain sockets on the depending on which Mac Pro you're using, either the riser card or onto the daughter board, because I can't remember why, but I just remember thinking that was my favorite thing for someone to come into the Genius Bar. It only happened to me twice, where somebody came in, they brought their Mac Pro, it wasn't booting. First thing I did, look at it, and I took out the RAM that was not wasn't in the right sockets, and corrected that and fixed the problem. And that was my favorite. That was my favorite repair.
Yeah, it goes back to the matched pair pieces that I was talking about, which I do not remember for sure. SD-RAM, whatever version. It's been so long.
Right?
Yeah, but I
remember the quadratic equation.
Well, I remember it
it's
being
been so long.
Specific conversations with regard to some derivative version of SD-RAM and DIMM sockets, and now it just feels like I'm remembering keywords.
Yeah.
But it's
I knew it at the time that it mattered.
Yeah. And of course, there's a whole separate conversation around error correcting RAM. ECC RAM that was typically used in servers, and that had to be matched pairs. But that's a whole different ballgame.
Well, that's what that you've answered you answered something that I didn't know the answer to, and that's why the Mac Pro required those paired RAMs, because they did use ECC RAM. They used ECC RAM and Xeon grade chip or Xeon chips.
Yes.
Or Xeon CPUs in the Intel Mac Pros. So there you go. I was going to say that was a great long segue in between, because from 1983 we didn't get any 3.5-inch floppy upgrades until 1986, and here's where we get the one that we know, the one that we cut our teeth on, and that's the 3.5-inch high density floppy disk. And it was 1,440 kilobytes formatted. And apparently the Amiga could get 1760 out of it, but it was marketed as 1.44 megabytes and 2 megabytes unformatted. I do, going back to...
I remember that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I remember on... the box for, I don't know if it's still on Apple devices, but I remember for a long period when I was working at Apple, for a long period of time, or maybe the entire time that I was working at Apple, they had on their boxes that basically the calculation 1 gigabyte or I don't remember if it was 1 gigabyte or 1 meg. I think it was 1 gigabyte because, most of the storage was measured in gigabytes. And at that point, memory was measured in gigabytes, but it was 1 gigabyte equals 1,000 megabyte. I just remember there being the base 10 calculation on it, and like just some blip that explained to you, like, the calculation. This is how we're calculating that you have a 250 megabyte hard drive, and when you get it formatted, it's gonna be less. So, but yeah, that's the 3.5-inch floppy we know and love is the high density disk. In 1987, there was a 3.5-inch high-density floppy disk that was 1,600 kilobytes on RISC OS, and it was marketed as a 1.6 megabyte disk. The marketed capacity was 1.6 megabytes, which is that's the closest that it's ever. The marketing capacity and the actual format was the same.
I do not remember those either. Like I shouldn't say that. I remember there being something past the 1.44, but I don't remember it well enough to say that was what I remember.
I don't remember it at all. And then in 1987, there was the 3.5-inch enhanced or extra high density diskette, and that was 2,880 kilobytes. Somehow the Sinclair QL got 3,200 kilobytes out of it, and it was marketed at the marketed capacity was 2.88, which was the same as the formatted capacity. So that was pretty. I think the only two things.
I do remember those. I remember being jealous of those because I never had a drive that was capable of using those.
I never saw the 1.6 high density, but I do remember seeing extra high density. And then after that, I think it was I think the episode was that you have a peak design problem that we were talking about diskettes. And that's where, from 1987 to 1996, there was no improvements, no changes. And that's when we get in 96 is when you get the 3.5-inch super disk, or the LS120, which was 120,375 kilobytes formatted and marketed as 120 megabytes. And in 1997, less than the next year, we get the same name, 3.5-inch super disk, but it was the LS240 with 240,750 kilobytes, or the marketed capacity being 240 megabytes. Interestingly,
and that overlapped with the zip drive advancement.
Yeah, that's when. Yep. Zip drive is not. I don't know when zip drive started, but it's around that time, late 90s, early 2000s. And at that point, something that I don't know if it didn't make it to market because there was no formatted storage information about this, but there is a 3.5-inch high capacity floppy disk, and it was marketed at having 150 or 200 megabytes, and it's saying it came out in 98 or 99. It's not clear, and it's not clear at the exact marketed capacity. So it makes me think that maybe this was something that was that was advertised but never actually made it to market.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. I do remember the 120 meg super disk, and I have vague recollections of the doubling of that at some point, which would have been the 240. But I don't remember seeing them in the wild. But I do very much remember around the time the 120 super disk was an option, zip drives at 100 meg were an option.
Yeah.
And I remember a lot of people jumping on the zip drive bandwagon because it was less expensive to do.
Interesting. But you'd have to buy a new drive.
You had to buy a new drive for the super disk too.
I was thinking that the super disk did not require a new drive. That's what I.
No. So
okay.
The one thing that I very much remember about the 3.5-inch drives every iteration had to be either capable of whatever current version of disk was available or backwards compatible. So if you had one that was capable of using, the what was the 2.8 for the post 1.44 drive size, like it could handle that particular capacity, but it could not handle the super disk 120 meg capacity because it wasn't able to read and write at that fine a layer on the magnetic medium. So the drive still had to be capable of reading and writing for the specific medium, but whatever version of the drive you had, it was backwards compatible with everything else. So if you had a drive that worked with the 120 meg super disk or 240 capacities, it would work with all the previous ones, but you had to have a drive that was capable of those newer iterations, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. See, I thought somehow they were able to. It may have been just me being misinformed at the time that the super disk could run in a standard, either 3.5-inch floppy that you had.
So I'm going to also add the caveat that I was working in a small little computer repair shop. The information I had available may or may not have been accurate.
Same.
Yeah, but I do remember problems with reading and writing media if it wasn't a new enough drive. And so that leads me to believe there were iterations of the drives that were capable of the more modern formats. And if you didn't have that version, it was, not capable of reading and writing that one. It would have been whatever version it was capable of and previous.
I like how in the early 80s they called out that they're single-sided. I mean, they were all single-sided, but they had to call out because 5 1/4 there was a double-sided. You could flip it over and it could be read on the other side. And so in the early 80s the first one was it was a single-sided diskette, and then advances and they got the double density. And so what I do know was that the original, I don't know that you would necessarily call it. It is a single density relative to the double density, but I don't know if you'd call it that. But that first disk going to double density, I know that the very first disk drives that could read those single-sided disks at 280 kilobytes could not read the double density disks, but the drives that were double density disk drives, they could read single density disks, but they couldn't write to them because the write head was too small, but they could read them. And so that's to me a big gotcha when you can have a drive. I can read and write to double density disk, but I can only read single density disk, and I felt like that's a big gotcha.
And along the same lines, like one of the things to remember too with this discussion, the 3.5-inch drives were notoriously finicky. And so you could have problems reading and writing to a disk just because the drive didn't like the brand of disk, much less anything else about it. And
I totally forgot about that.
And so a lot of the questions around whether a drive worked with certain capacities were obfuscated, really, because you didn't know if maybe it was just that brand disk that it was having a problem with, or, I mean, there were so many problems in general with 3.5-inch floppies, regardless of capacity, that you could be remembering something factual from experience that should not have been factual on paper, and vice versa.
Don't copy that floppy.
That was fun, though. Like trying to figure out which brand of disk you were going to buy because it was most ubiquitously compatible with all the different drives you would encounter over the course of your day.
Yeah, my go-to. I had so many AOL disks that I use tape to make them writable again.
3M was the big one that
Yep.
we always
Yep.
made sure we had 2 or 3 of those available. Because worst case scenario, if whatever other disk you didn't have, or whatever other disk you had didn't work, you could bet that a 3M disk would at least be functional. You may not get the full capacity, which is a whole nother problem in and of itself, but at least it would work. And
Uh,
I mean, just even talking about it now, like thinking about those caveats and workarounds, and we just accepted it as normal behavior.
I mean, you did. I mean, it didn't matter that you accepted or didn't accept it. That's how it was.
Right.
And at some point, somebody was like, "No, this is unacceptable," and formats got better. But I was gonna say, 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago, I had access. I don't know why we had it, but the Apple store I was working in had a 3.5-inch floppy drive that would connect to USB, and I was like, you know what? I don't think I'm ever going to see one of these again. And so I was like, okay. So I one day, because I still had a box of floppies, and it was a small one because I'd never accumulated that many, less than 25 floppies, but I brought them all in on my like I came to work an hour early and brought a computer, and I brought my floppy disk, and I connected to it in the back and copied all of my floppies onto my computer at the time, because I was like, I'm never gonna see one of these again. And I have not seen a 3.5-inch floppy drive since then. I'm fairly confident that I also copied the 3.5-inch floppy icon in Mac OS 10 and made it my folder icon for all that data. Where it is on my computer, I am not sure.
As you were talking, I remember having access to an external floppy at one point and doing something similar, but I was racking my brain. I don't know that I even kept wherever I transferred that to. Like in my head, I very vividly remember a number of computer science classes that I had where I had saved work on floppies, and I'm sure I had other stuff as well, but like that's what came to mind. I don't think I have a copy of that stuff anywhere. Not that it was important, like it honestly could care less. It's in a programming language that isn't even relevant today. But like I don't think I have those. And it was just a kind of startling realization as you were talking about it. Like I remember specifically making copies of stuff off of disk for that very reason, and I don't even know what I did with whatever copies I made. I hate to think about how much shit in general I've lost over the years, just moving stuff around and backups and, copying stuff from one format to another and blah, blah, blah. Like it.
I can't. I'm not sure that I've lost. I'm not sure that I've lost anything other than my Peak Design emails that orders that I actually need to what's the
Verify warranty.
Sure. Yes, thank you. And that's the only thing I can think of that I'm missing. But I do know that there's a bunch of stuff that's just not organized. And one day,
so I do know for sure that there have been things in general that I've lost because I have the original media for a lot of stuff that I recorded on Mini DV back in the day, and Digital 8 and High 8 prior to that. But I have no way to play those now to redigitize. And so at some point I have lost my digital copies of those items, even though I have the original media available. But I know I do not have the original media available with regard to floppies ever. Like, I don't even know the last time I saw a floppy disk in anything that I have packed away. I'm pretty sure all of that was lost at least 10 years ago, if not longer. But it's because I had moved everything to CDs, and then I have subsequently either shredded or disposed of or destroyed CDs without having other copies, and I don't know, whatever. Anything that was overly important I have, but there's a lot of stuff that I know I've lost over time.
I've definitely lost a video that I made when I was my dad's camcorder. I definitely lost that, and because I didn't have the equipment to do what I needed to do, because it was a DV recorder, so on tape, and I just didn't understand. I didn't know the technology, and so I copied them. Because those cassettes were expensive, so I would record, copy it to VHS, and then re-record over it. And those VHS cassettes, I'm pretty sure I left them in a dorm somewhere, and they're gone. Like 20 years ago.
Fun fact, I have a mini DV Panasonic camcorder that's still functional that I actually used to redigitize stuff that I had on mini DV. But the Sony camcorder that I'd used for Digital 8 and High 8 was no longer functional. So the stuff that was on Digital 8 and High 8, I was not able to redigitize. I just have the discs, or the tape cassettes, sitting in a box, thinking that maybe I'll either dispose of them or whatever. I have no clue at this point. But they don't mean anything. They're not usable. But I was impressed that the mini DV stuff that I had was still recoverable, and I was able to recreate those digital files last year. None of it was worth shit. Like, I shouldn't have even spent the time doing it, but whatever.
We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.
Floppy disk drive, 5 1/4 inch or a 3 1/2 inch disk drive. Floppy disk drive, floppy diskette, floppy disk. Floppy diskette, floppy disk. Disk drive, diskette, diskettes, 5 1/4 inch floppy disk, double density diskette, high density diskette, low density disk drive, double density diskette, high density disk drive, double density diskettes, high density diskettes, smaller floppy diskettes, 3 1/2 inch floppy diskettes. A low-density disk drive, double-density diskettes, high-density disk drive, low and high-density diskette, new cool software, floppy diskette, floppy diskette, floppy disk, floppy diskette, floppy disk with its computer. One floppy disk drive, floppy disk inside the disk drive, floppy diskette out, but I have to say, one floppy disk drive, floppy diskette, you have to take a floppy diskette, floppy diskettes, floppy diskettes, floppy diskette, floppy diskettes. Floppy diskette, hard disk, startup disk, system disk, floppy diskette, jump out of your car while driving down the freeway, computer viruses, floppy disk, computer viruses, floppy diskette, my floppy diskette, disk drive, floppy disk, floppy diskette, this diskette gets.